Hi, welcome back to Power of Storytime. I'm Kate, the creative director of Calling Card Books and Z Girls Press. And every Wednesday we read from our books. Today we're joined by author Michael Foster. Welcome back.
Thank you. Hello, everybody.
Yeah. And then this Friday at 5 p.m. we'll also be reading from What Goes Unseen, so make sure to join us then. We don't do it every Friday, but we do a broadcast every Wednesday at noon. And so since we have you here, Michael, we want to talk a little bit about the difference between the two books, because the first one, there were a lot of animals in it, and we had kind of talked before that they've been inspired by animals that you saw at the cabin, or animals that you and your wife Valeria interacted with at the cabin. And that was kind of like a sweet younger story, and now the sequel, Finding the Lost, is Alicia's a little bit more grown up, it's a little bit more dark and gritty and fantasy-y, and there still are some animals in it, but it seems like a lot of the characters this time around were inspired by locations that are actually around the cabin that you had. What made you inspired to write about the locations this time around?
Well, I guess the first thing, in the creation of it, and there wasn't a plan to do book two, and so book one ended in a certain way, which I actually write about on my blog on michaelscabinbooks.com. You can see how the original one originally ended. But with some great feedback from you guys, it changed my focus in book two, and I didn't want to return to this world unless I could tell a story that was a little bit different from book one. I didn't want to just repeat myself too much. Obviously, anybody who's a fan of any kind of work, movie, book, music, for example, they want the second album to sound just like the first one, because they love the first album, right? So you want the second album to sound just the same. So I knew as a reader I wanted to, or as a writer, I wanted to keep the readers in the same world, but make it different and unique enough. And so the idea came toward the end of the editing of book one, was what if I tell the story of the world more? This book was definitely Alicia's story, and it followed her. And while I described some of the world, most of the description was around her and her friends and her specific encounters. I wanted to go back and talk about this world, and I thought one of the best ways to do that would be to create kind of a travel log of sorts.
Yeah.
And that also brought about, I had time to go back in book one and briefly introduce the ancients as characters, but not go into detail, thinking that this would be something I could use in the future during the creation of book two. And that's kind of how it came about. I wanted to do something a little bit different and expand the world that Alicia was in.
That's part of what I love about it is, like you said, the first book is really about relationships, and the second one is kind of about the world. And it feels like as Alicia is growing up, so is the story and the world around her, and maybe it's a little bit more dark and sinister, like as you're going into high school as she is, things get a little bit more complicated, they sometimes get a little bit more dark and scary. So I love that element of like the book growing up as she does.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was excited to do it, and as I mentioned in the blog post about this, my original idea was to revisit it with Alicia as an adult and have her child be a character also. But then through conversations with you and thinking about it, I realized, going back to that, what I mentioned about people who enjoy a product want the second product to be kind of the
Yeah.
same. I thought if I took away the main character, they would be disappointed that now they have to learn and follow a new character, and it wouldn't feel the same. So I wanted to keep those ties to the original, and I think that was a good choice at the end.
I remember Peanut Gallery remembers the conversation where there was a moment of discovery, and you shared the fact that, yeah, it's not going to be her as an adult anymore. I came up with an idea of that, and we were both, oh my God.
It was really cool to see when it clicked and you're like, oh, all these pieces fell into place, and it just came, the speed with which you wrote was incredible. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the three ancients that we get to know in this book are all kind of based on locations around the cabin. Were there any places that you thought could maybe inspire an ancient but didn't quite make the cut?
Yes, actually, there are, growing up, there are several locations every summer when I go back to the cabin. There are several locations that stand out as important to me. They were important in my childhood, and they still exist. And just looking at them, for example, there's a very large rock you can see from anywhere in the valley that our cabin is in, called Cougar Rock, and it stands up there, and it's kind of this awesome thing where so I didn't end up using it as an ancient, but it did inspire another character in the book. So I don't know if you've gotten to that point, and I don't want to spoil anything. There was definitely that was a location that had inspiration, not as an ancient, but
as a new character. Yeah, we left Alicia when she had just found her parents frozen in amber, so we haven't quite gotten there yet. Yeah.
Okay.
But that is fun. And there's a fun story with that. I think we'll probably save it for once we do meet that character, but the way you came up with the name is a great story that we'll have to get to sometime. Let's see.
I see you have an image of one of the ancients on the screen. It's funny, when I was imagining this ancient, I definitely imagined, and I don't know why, but I imagined the actor Sam Elliott.
Oh, really?
I love him. And I don't know why, but that was what came to mind. He has such this iconic
the mustache,
Old West cowboy look. I mean, he's such a great actor, and he's a wonderful voice. And during the creation of the book and the creation of that character by the artist Gloria, I never told her I was thinking of that actor. She just went by the description in the book, and then you look at the image, and it's like, hey, it's kind of Sam Elliott.
She got the mustache pretty dead on. It's impressive.
Yeah. So I thought that was really funny. Wow, I guess I described it well enough. That good. There I see.
Yes, our next ancient.
Another one of the ancients. Again, I don't want to get ahead and spoil anything, but I visited a museum in Brazil where I saw these sculptures, and the polish and the detail was so amazing and so smooth that when I was writing this character, I went back to those sculptures, and it was like there's veils in these sculptures that are just almost gossamer thin, and it's just incredible to see, and it really stuck with me, and those images went into my description of this character of being skin almost like a statue.
Yeah, we've seen a few of those where they have a veil or something, and like it's amazing what somebody can like create out of stone that makes it look so much like fabric and so light and airy, even though it's like a very hard material. Yeah. And then I think we have one more ancient. Oh, let's see, it doesn't want to work here. Or save the best for last.
Obviously, the most creepy of the ancients, for sure, and it was the location that this ancient is in. I've been in that location, and it was terrifying. It was completely irresponsible. I should not have been there, and completely unsafe. But I was there, and I drew from everything that I experienced in that location: the sights, the textures, the smells, and my own sense of fear and unease at being there. I drew on all that to create this character.
I was going to say the sense of danger during that scene, which we'll probably be getting to soon, like it really comes through in the book. It especially compared to the first book, like there were some scary scenes there, but this one, even to me as an adult, was like a little, what's going to happen?
It definitely drew on real life.
Yeah.
It's probably today. It's not something I would do again.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Well, was there anything else you wanted to mention before we let you go? I know you've got a lot of work you need to be getting back to, and we'll get to reading here in a bit.
Yeah. I wish I could stay longer. This is always fun, but I know we can save some stuff for next week.
Yeah. Yeah. Plenty of stories to cover.
So, yeah, I will leave it to you to continue the reading. I want to say thank you for having me on again, and hello to all the readers and fans, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah. We are so glad that you're able to join us most weeks. It's really fun having you on.
All right. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too. All right. Okay, so as I said to Michael last week, we left off with Alicia finding her parents trapped in a bubble. She was banging on the bubble trying to release them, and nothing happened, and she came to the realization that there was some magic afoot, and the only place that she knows of magic near the cabin is the wild side. So she's hunting down some magic that might be able to free her parents. And if you missed any of the earlier readings, or if you missed us reading Moose Beach, you can always go to michaelscabinbooks.com to watch those earlier episodes, or our YouTube or Facebook channel have them as well. But we're going to jump back in with Chapter 3, Preparations. And in preparing, I'm going to take a little sip of water. Alicia rose from where she collapsed at the base of the bubble. She looked at her frozen parents for another moment, turned and tossed the bloody rock aside, then ran to the cabin. Flinging open the door, Alicia moved swiftly to the kitchen table and grabbed her backpack, upending it on the table, and dumped a variety of pens, pencils, erasers, books, and paper onto the Formica surface with a clatter. Focused on the task at hand, she ignored several items that bounced to the floor, took the now empty backpack, and scanned the interior of the small cabin with determination. There would be no more traveling in the wild simply with a bathing suit and a towel. This time, she had every intention to be better prepared before crossing, if that was even a possibility. Alicia quickly built a mental checklist: food, water, flashlight, blanket, knife. She had no idea how long her journey might take, but she wanted to make sure she had all the necessities. Alicia knew she could scavenge for food and water. After all, she had already spent a long time in the wild side during her last visit, and her friends there had taught her so much. But it was good to have emergency rations, just in case. "Fortune favors the prepared mind," her dad liked to quote. Her friends! Would she see Mickey, Fiona, and Briar again? A squirrel, a deer, and a jaybird were the most unusual trio of companions one could ever ask for. A brief moment of excitement flared inside her at the thought, and a small smile touched her lips. But it was quickly erased by a glance out of the dusty cabin window and the sight of her parents trapped there, beyond the edge of the forest. What had caused this? She set her mind to the task of gathering essentials. Alicia never changed out of her pajamas and slippers since getting out of bed. She yanked on a pair of jeans and dug through her suitcase, which remained unpacked since their arrival the previous day. Alicia pulled on a t-shirt and a light jacket, which should be enough to protect her from the branches that might scratch her bare arms as she moved through the woods. Finally, she sat down on the wooden floor and slid her feet into long socks and hiking boots. The shoes were a bit old now and pinched her toes due to a growth spurt she went through earlier in the summer, but they were all she had. She would be going into high school quite a bit taller than she had left the 8th grade, so her mom had planned to take her shopping for new clothes as soon as they got back home from the cabin. Standing, Alicia grabbed a thin but warm blanket from the bed and stuffed it down into the depths of her backpack. She went to the cabinet and took out a flashlight and a small folding pocket knife. The flashlight went into the pack and the knife was tucked in the front pocket of her jeans. Having noticed a large box of wooden matches on the cabinet as well, knowing she wanted to be able to make fire in the evenings. There was a large package of beef jerky on the counter as well as a homemade trail mix, gorp as her family liked to call it, and both went into the pack. Lastly, she grabbed her thermos, filling it from the sink, cold water splashing onto her fingers in her haste. She then slid the full container into a pouch on the side of the backpack. Alicia gathered a piece of paper from the table and a pencil from where it had rolled off onto the floor. She hastily scribbled a note to her parents. "If you see this and wonder where I am, don't worry. I went over to Moose Beach for a little hike. I'll be back soon. Love, Leash." She left it on the countertop, plainly visible to anyone who walked in. A mental tally and final glance around the cabin assured her she hadn't forgotten anything. She put her arms through the loops of her backpack and, cinching the straps tight, stepped out the door and onto the trail towards the lake. Alicia slowed as she walked past her mom and dad and stopped to look at them again. She approached the not quite visible bubble with the sun glinting off the surface and spoke softly. "I'm going. I have to find an answer, and I think I know where to look. Please don't worry about me. I'll be safe, I promise." Who knew if they even could worry? Maybe they could hear her, maybe not. Looking at them, seeing them in this way, was surreal. Her father's eyes were open wide, and she could see the blue-green color of his irises. His eyes looked like two shiny marbles. Alicia had seen taxidermy work before, a stuffed raccoon in a roadside convenience store, or the head of a deer on the wall of one of her parents' friends' houses. Seeing her father this way reminded her of it, and she shuddered at the thought of her parents, stuffed and mounted. "I'll be back as soon as I can," she promised. "I'm sure we can fix this." In truth, she didn't feel sure at all, but the words felt necessary. If not for her parents, then for her to speak them out loud. A robin sang in a nearby tree. The happiness in its voice did not match the deep sadness Alicia felt. "I love you both, and I'll see you soon." With that, she turned away and headed toward the lake path. The determined girl walked quickly to the small slope and looked down the hill at her dock and the rowboat tied to the shore. Moving carefully, she descended the slope. As she walked down the path, Alicia glanced towards the trees lining the trail on her right and came to an abrupt halt, staring at what she saw. Another glint hung in the air next to one of the trees. On the surface of a large pine were two red squirrels, paused mid-chase, frozen exactly like her parents. The girl stepped towards the tree and reached her hand out gingerly, feeling the familiar coldness of the invisible sphere. "Oh my gosh, it was here too!" She hurried back to the path, unease growing within her, and continued down to the lake and the waiting boat. If it was here as well, how many more places was this happening? Reaching the lake, Alicia stepped up to the tree stump where the rowboat was tied. The old boat, painted green and yellow, rocked gently in the small waves. She untied the knot and slowly pulled the boat along with her as she stepped out to the shore and onto the wooden dock. She stared across the lake, picking out the recognizable shape of Moose Beach along the far shoreline. It was her destination. Alicia dragged the boat to the front of the dock and knelt alongside it, feeling the wood grain of the dock's hard boards digging into her knees. She pulled off her backpack, placed it on the floorboards of the boat, and grabbed a life jacket from where it lay discarded on the seat. Pulling on the life jacket, she buckled it tightly around her chest. Alicia was a good swimmer, having learned here in this very lake, but it was never wise to overestimate one's ability. If she were to capsize in the boat in the middle of the lake, she wasn't confident she would have the strength to be able to swim all the way to shore. Alicia gently put one leg over the side of the boat and firmly rested it on the floorboards, gaining her balance before stepping in with the other leg and taking a seat on the bench in the middle of the boat. She pushed away from the dock, lifted one of the oars from where it was stored along the inside wall of the boat, and fitted it snugly into the oarlock. She did the same for the other side, sat up straight, taking one oar in each hand. She began practicing rowing over the past couple of years with her dad, and as a result of her recent growth spurt, her arms were even longer and more easily able to manage the oars on either side. She was endlessly amused by the fact that the rower sat backwards in the boat the whole time. This amusing thought broke the tension of the moment. Worried for her parents and herself, Alicia knew what she had to do. Pushing down on the handles, she leaned forward, forcing the oars into the air behind her. A light breeze danced across her cheeks, making her hair flutter before traveling onward in the direction of the far shore. Good, she thought. That breeze will help with the rowing. As she lifted her arms, the paddle sunk into the water. So she pulled back hard, feeling her muscles tighten as the oars fought the resistance of the water, making the little boat move slowly backwards. Looking over her shoulder, she adjusted her aim a bit, getting the front of the boat pointed towards the proper spot on the far shore, and repeated the motion, digging in again with the oars, the resistance somewhat diminished thanks to the momentum she was building. It would take about 15 minutes to cross the lake. Alicia fell into a rhythm. Push down, lean forward, raise up, pull back, over and over again, letting her mind drift. She didn't know what to expect when she got to the other side, but memories of her first visit to the wild side came back, and she started to form a plan. Now we have Chapter 4, The Journey Begins. Another little water break. Alicia reached the opposite side of the lake with little incident. Looking to her left and right as she rowed, unusual but familiar glints glistened in the air in the far distance. At one point she passed an osprey trapped in mid-flight, a fish stiffly clutched in his sharp talons. Whatever was happening, it was widespread. She heard the beating in her chest above the sounds of nature. These sights terrified her. Was it happening only here at her lake, close to the barrier of the other rim, or had it spread much further, outside the woods into the cities beyond? Was her English teacher, instead of thinking about the new school year and reports she would soon be grading, sitting locked in place at her table with a cup of coffee raised, prepared to take a drink that never came? Goose flesh raised on her arms at the thought. Reaching the other side of the lake, Alicia stopped rowing and let the last bit of momentum carry the boat gently to shore. She allowed the tip to bump against the reeds and grass of the shoreline before taking action. Moving swiftly, she tied the boat to the same fallen tree her father had tied the boat to 3 years earlier, and hung a rubber bumper over each side of the boat as protection against knocking into the logs and rocks. After stepping out with the same care she entered the boat, Alicia took off her life jacket and tossed it back onto the floorboards. Standing on the beach with her hands on her hips, she studied the forest in front of her. It didn't look any different than the other section of the woods that she had seen a million times in her life. here at the lake, but she knew how deep down that was. She had been back on this beach on several occasions since the events of 3 years ago, but had never returned to the wild side. It would be different. Equal parts excitement and trepidation filled her. Alicia let her mind go back to when she was 11 years old. What had she done? She remembered watching her father messing about with the boat, and then seeing something out of the corner of her eye that distracted her. What had it been? She tried to focus on some barely seen movement that she couldn't seem to get in focus. Every time her eyes darted in that direction, it would vanish and appear elsewhere. That's right, my eyes. She had to let her eyes go out of focus. She had to look beyond. Reaching back towards the rowboat, Alicia grabbed her backpack and strapped it on. She turned once more to face the forest. Okay, let's do this, she said to herself, and started into the shadows beyond the edge, letting her eyes relax. The darkness of the shadows remained simply that, dark. Nothing happened. Oh no, she thought. What if I can't go back? She stared harder, trying to let her mind wander so that her eyes could remain unfocused, but it was impossible. Arrgh! Alicia screamed in frustration, startling a group of orioles gathered in the nearby bush into flight. What was she supposed to do now? This was her only hope. The only idea she came up with for trying to save her parents. Was she supposed to go back and wait and do nothing but hope for things to get better? Alicia felt beads of sweat trickle down the back of her neck while she struggled to come up with a solution. Perhaps she could try to row to the lodge and seek help there. But what if they were frozen too? No, the answers had to be on the wild side. How could this happen to her parents? It wasn't fair. She had already rescued that stupid realm, and now this? She seethed with the injustice of it all. No, I will not give up, she shouted to her frozen surroundings. Focusing all the frustration inside of her, she stared once again into the forest, fists balled at either side, and let her eyes go soft. Suddenly, like a blurry image coming into focus under a microscope, the world snapped into clarity. She saw it. Alicia stepped forward and in. A tingle rushed through her body, racing down her arms and legs, as if the largest goose in the world had walked over her grave. The feeling held for a moment, almost painful in its intensity, raising the hairs on her arms and her neck underneath her jacket, then slowly fading away. How strange, she thought, shaking her arms as if to fling the last of the goosebumps off. She paused to look a moment around the woods, noticing once again the intensity of the colors in the wild side. How deep the greens and reds appeared here, how bright and sunny the yellows. The air felt significantly warmer and smelled cleaner too, which made a sort of sense considering the lack of factories and vehicles belching out smoke into the air. She looked deeply into the forest for any sign of her friends, but no one was around. A profound sense of disappointment crept into her chest, but she angrily banished it. What did I expect? She asked out loud. A welcome party? Of course, they would not simply be waiting here. That was a silly thought. Nobody knew she was coming. But as she stepped farther into the realm, her eyes continued to watch for familiar faces. It all looked so different. Though only 3 years had passed, everything appeared overgrown. Clearly, the release of Grantree's water during the last visit had had tremendous side effects on the vegetation in the wild side. Alicia glanced behind her and saw the lake was still there. The last time she was here, a meadow stretched out as far as the eye could see. However, now she saw the sparkling blue water right where it belonged. Though she could no longer see the cabin on the other side, there was still a shimmer in the air, right where she had stepped through. Strange, it hadn't been there the last time she came here. Alicia paused to get her bearings. She already formed a loose plan in her mind during the trip across the lake. She remembered Mickey telling her about how the barrier between worlds had been formed so long ago. He had talked of the great ancient ones, Thunderbolt, Vulcan, and the Silver King, all coming together and using their combined power to separate the realms of mankind and magic. Based on their descriptions, she recognized them all as physical locations in her world. Thunderbolt was a tall mountain to the north, Vulcan was a large clearing filled with hot springs to the southwest. And even further south was the old Eureka Silver King mine. Surely, that all could not be a coincidence, considering that it must have taken tremendous magic to create that barrier. Alicia believed that one of the ancients would understand the magic at work back home and have a solution to free her parents. She decided she should start by going to Thunderbolt. The mountain of the same name was the highest peak in the area, towering over the lands, and she imagined that, just like Zeus on Mount Olympus, the being there must watch over everything. She recalled that Mickey had said it was actually the Silver King who was the strongest of the ancient ones, but Thunderbolt was the closest, and Alicia was determined to find a solution quickly and get back home to her parents. She had no idea what long-term effects of being frozen in a bubble might be, but it couldn't be good. So that settled it. She would make the mountain her first destination. Alicia surveyed the ground quickly, looking for a good walking stick, a must-have for any hike. She spotted a dead fallen tree close by. Walking over to it, she grabbed one of the long branches sticking out and pulled hard. With a loud snap, it separated from the tree trunk. Alicia picked up a stone and ran up and down along the upper section of the branch, removing any extra pokey bits and creating a smooth spot to grip. With her pack strapped tightly to her back and a walking stick in hand, Alicia glanced one more time at the lake, across the water to where her cabin existed in the world. Using the large body of water as a point of reference, she set herself due north and headed out, picking her way through the overgrowth, her eyes searching for a trail to ease the passage. As Alicia walked, she continued to look around, hoping to see her squirrel friend come bounding through the brush, or hear Briar's familiar caw, caw, as he swooped down from the treetops. However, nothing but the regular sounds of the forest, the wind through the branches above, the chirping of birds, and the quiet of hidden insects. Why am I thinking this way? Alicia asked herself. Talking squirrels and telepathic deer, of course they aren't here. They're living their animal lives, moved on the same as I have. She scolded herself through her thoughts. I'm not 11 anymore, geesh. Let's forget about that and focus on what's important. First, I've got to get up that darn mountain. Then I have to go home and rescue Mom and Dad. And finally, I've got to finish that blasted report before the next week. She laughed unexpectedly. I sure am going to have a story to tell about my summer vacation, she blurted out loud. The insect sounds paused briefly with an outburst of noise, then resumed their whisper of music. I only hope there's a school to go back to, she said, talking to herself and thinking about how many of the strange frozen bubbles she had seen. She wondered how far this epidemic had spread. Oh, it's a little close to home nowadays, eh? So now we're going on to Chapter 5, Childhood Loss. It's funny how sometimes art imitates life and sometimes life imitates art. Okay. Alicia quickly discovered that the hike was much more challenging than she expected. With many fallen trees, the great tangle of bushes everywhere, and no clear path. She had to clamber over rotten logs that slowed her progress significantly. She hoped that she could get at least close, if not all the way, to the base of Thunderbolt the night before nightfall. But it looked like she wouldn't be able to make it now. The girl stopped for a moment to catch her breath and survey the surroundings. She could not believe the amount of growth in 3 years since her first visit to the wild side. The last time she had been here, the only time actually, the lands were starved for water thanks to the great tree that had chosen to steal all the rain for himself. During the time her friends called the drying, it was dusty, with little undergrowth to tangle her feet. But now it looked practically prehistoric. The colors were rich, deep browns and greens, the massive ferns dotted the landscape. The water the grand tree released certainly caused quite the growth spurt. Perhaps the moisture absorbed some of the yellow pine's magic while it was stored inside the great tree, and was now passing along the magic to the plants that absorbed it. Alicia chuckled. I went through the same growth spurt myself over the past 3 years. Maybe the magic's in me, too. I do remember Bristleback and Graintree saying they saw something magical in me, but I never felt anything. While resting, she let her mind drift back to thoughts of Bristleback, the enormous mountain troll. Alicia only knew him for such a short time, but she and the very old, misunderstood creature had bonded quickly through shared loss of family. His death came far too suddenly, but his passing had given her the strength to meet Graintree and demand change. Bristleback's stony remains clearing, clear proof of what the yellow pine had done to the lands, forced Graintree to face the truth of his ways. In the end, Alicia believed that the mountain troll's death had helped save them all, and helped her find the way home. 3 years later, she felt the onset of tears when thinking about her old friend. She pushed thoughts aside to focus more intently on the task at hand, getting through the darn bushes and finding a trail. With a groan, Alicia resumed her trek, using the walking stick like a machete, slashing at the bushes and swiping away the branches from fallen trees so she could pass without getting scratched. She frequently glanced west to keep her bearings, and seeing the twinkling glint of sun at the lake confirmed that she was still on track. The trees were too densely packed in the section of woods, eliminating a clear line of sight to the mountain, which was her destination. So the determined hiker relied on the lake for directions. Alicia noted that she had not seen any of the bubbles of frozen time here on the wild side. Did that mean the phenomenon only affected her world? Did the magic here prevent it from happening? She didn't have the answer, but she hoped the Ancient One she traveled to see would have one. Oh, please let this work, she pleaded, talking out loud to keep herself company, and hoping that maybe her words would be heard by whatever powers existed in this realm. She continued trudging through the brush, looking off into the distance for any telltale signs of a trail. As she walked, Alicia became acutely aware of how much more noise the forest made here than it did at home. Even more than the last time she was here. The absence of humans in this world of magic allowed the wild creatures to flourish. The sounds of bugs and birdsong filled the air, along with some other unidentifiable squeals and whistles. It was almost like listening to an orchestra tune their instruments before performing. A beautiful cacophony of noises that you could get lost in. A handsome robin landed on a nearby branch, and Alicia paused to watch it. The bird's dark wings and reddish-orange breast looked beautiful, so she spoke to him. "Hello, Mr. Robin," she said sweetly. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" The bird only watched the girl with curiosity. His small black eyes were focused on the stranger, inquisitive, but he did not respond. After a moment, the bird flitted his wings and flew off towards another branch, its eyes ever watchful for bugs or caterpillars. "Well, I guess that one doesn't speak," she said glumly. Come to think of it, she'd heard the noises of small creatures scuttling through the bushes, and maybe even something larger moving close by, yet unseen, but none of the animals had come to see her. They may feel curious about her, but they did not attempt to communicate. Could her companions from 3 years ago have been an anomaly? She assumed, perhaps incorrectly, that most all denizens of the forest could speak. Alicia paused with a horrible thought passing through her head. Maybe none of them had talked, her friends from before. Could it have been like when she played dolls as a young child, making up unique voices for each one? After all, she had participated in many back-and-forth conversations with her favorite toys when she was little, and she had firmly believed that they were alive in their own ways. But those were merely childish games, right? She knew better now. I'm almost in high school, she thought. There is no room for make-believe anymore. Could she have imagined the conversation of 3 years ago? The thought saddened her deeply. Maybe this is part of growing up, she mused, with more than a touch of sorrow, speaking aloud as if it would help convince her it was the truth. Maybe letting go of the magic of childhood and the childish things that go along with it is a necessary step on the path to becoming an adult. Alicia resisted that idea. She felt excited to grow up, she really did. and she couldn't wait to go to high school and get to know her new teachers and make new friends, and maybe even meet a nice boy. Isn't that what happens in high school? But she also did not want to lose the magic she felt at the cabin. Perhaps it was inevitable, and she made a promise to herself right then and there that no matter what, she would always hold on to her memories of when she was young, when the world had been a mystery just waiting to be explored. Alicia returned her attention to the hike and fell into a sort of trance. Whack bushes, break branches, step over logs, repeat. Her long legs made it easy for her to navigate all over the fallen detritus that lay strewn across the forest floor. Just 3 years ago, she would have had to make more of an effort, climbing up and over some of the logs that she now easily cleared with a jump. With the rhythm established, she increased her speed a bit, though she still wished for some sort of trail to follow. The sun began to drop below the tree line on the opposite side of the lake. It was that time of evening when the wind suddenly decided to stop, as if holding its breath. Sorry, I'm being attacked by a cat down here. Well, everyone, I'd like to welcome Julian to the broadcast. Okay. Where were we? Even though she still had quite a bit of time left before nightfall, Alicia decided to make camp now, well before daylight. Sorry. Alicia decided to make camp now while there was still daylight. Looking around, she found a nearby spot that had less vegetation and a little more space, and she set about clearing the area of as much debris as possible. Wanting to build a small campfire, it was particularly important to remove any dead branches and pine needles. Sloughing off her backpack, she placed it on the ground and began searching the area, scanning for something specific. Spotting what she was looking for, the teenager walked a few yards away and picked up a long branch that still had several patches of green pine needles on it. It had most likely broken from the tree during the windstorm, or perhaps the bear had climbed the pine and snapped off the branch with the weight of its claws. Returning to the clearing, she used the branch almost like a broom, sweeping away the combustible material from the ground and creating a nice empty space in the center. With that task completed, Alicia went about the business of collecting stones. The bigger they were, the better. She set them in a small circle about 2 feet in diameter, and then continued piling stones until she created a nice barrier. Digging into her pockets, she pulled the knife out that she had tucked away there. Alicia repeatedly stabbed the knife into the ground in the center of the stones, loosening the soil, and scooped the dirt out, forming a shallow pit within the circle of stones. Once she finished, Alicia put her knife back in her pocket and collected handfuls of the dead pine needles and some sticks that she had swept away, piling them loosely in the center of the pit. Needles on the bottom, sticks on top. Finally, she gathered a collection of assorted dead branches to use as logs for her fire. She piled these nearby, close enough that she would not have to search for them in the dark, but far enough away to remove any danger of sparks or coals popping out of the fire and burning them. As she did this, Alicia remembered her previous trek, when she and her furry friends piled into small caverns, huddling together for warmth. Now she was on a mission for answers to save her parents, so she was prepared, unlike the first time she had stumbled into the wild side. Alicia knelt and dug into her backpack, pulling out the bags of trail mix and beef jerky. She had a good amount of each, considering her options and glancing toward the lake. Another idea popped into her head. She stuffed the food back in the pack and went in search of a long, sharp stick. Finding a nice heavy one about 3 feet in length, she came back to the clearing, sat down, and pulled out the pocket knife once again. Holding the stick firmly in one hand, she slid the knife blade down towards the end, slicing the wood in small strokes away from her as she rotated the stick until she had a nice pointy tip. Alicia stood and hefted the crude spear in one hand, testing its balance and weight. At that moment, she felt like she belonged in this prehistoric world, and she was going to feast on fish for dinner. Alicia sat close to the small campfire she had made, holding her fish over the flames, using a thick willow branch she'd carved as a skewer. She almost spent an hour trying to hunt fish with her makeshift spear, thrusting it into the water near the shoreline and missing several times. Night was falling, and she was worried that the encroaching darkness would make it impossible to see, but eventually her efforts paid off. She looked forward to the trout she had nearly finished cooking. Fully dark now, the sunlight and accompanying birdsong gave way to shadows, as well as an increase in the volume of insect noise. It seemed the bugs instinctively knew when their predators had gone to sleep for the night, so they felt safe enough to sing their unique songs. The chirping crickets were the loudest, creating a perfectly consistent tempo for the rest of the band to follow along. The moon was still a few days away from being full, so she couldn't see much beyond the reach of the firelight and the edge of the clearing that she had created. However, she could hear small noises just outside her range of vision. Alicia knew nocturnal creatures like flying squirrels and mice would be out scavenging for seeds and grubs at this hour. Staring off into the darkness of the woods, Alicia saw small lights in the distance that she had never seen before. They'd flick and hover like hummingbirds, then dart away quickly. They were too far, and it was too dark for her to be able to identify them, but she thought they looked a bit like fireflies. The truth is, she hadn't seen fireflies in real life, only in books. Because of her love of folklore, she had also read about will-o'-the-wisps, phantom lights that could lure unsuspecting travelers to their deaths. Even though she didn't believe in the tales, Alicia decided it would be best not to investigate the lights, choosing instead to focus on cooking her dinner. She had no idea what was possible in the wild side. Her love of the outdoors meant she was not afraid of the dark, and never had been for that matter, having spent plenty of time outside at night with her parents, going on short hikes with their flashlights, or laying on the dock looking up at the stars. The night sky looked amazing this far removed from the lights of the city, with the Milky Way clearly visible. In August, the Perseid meteor shower filled the sky with shooting stars. One of her favorite nighttime activities was walking along the trail to Aunt Molly's hot springs by the river near their cabin. At some point in the past, campers had hauled old bathtubs and placed them near the springs to catch the natural thermal water that boiled over the rocks on the side of a hill before flowing down to join the river. The water directly from the rocks was too hot to touch, but you could walk to the river with a bucket, scoop up the cold water, and carry it back to the tubs, and dump it in to bring the temperature back down to the perfect level for soaking. The steam would rise, billowing into the sky, and if you were quite quiet and lucky, a young fawn might wander by while you were enjoying a warm bath. Her fish was almost ready, so Alicia rested her skewer between the two stones on the edge of the fire, digging the handle end of the stick into the soft dirt so that it wouldn't tip over and drop her meal into the coals. She turned and grabbed her backpack, removing the knife from the front pocket where she had stored it after carving the cooking stick. Flipping open the pocket knife, she turned back towards the campfire, froze, her breath caught in her throat. Staring at her from the dark woods on the opposite side of the flames, there were two eyes, the deepest shade of gold she had ever seen. Alicia couldn't move, she couldn't think. All she could do was stare at those eyes, hovering a few feet above the ground. The golden eyes held hers unblinking, the firelight reflecting off their surface. All the sounds of the woods had seemed to have stopped. The lights she had seen dancing through the trees were no longer visible. A silence that settled over her camp was almost deafening. The only wind, which had reawakened with the setting of the sun, had a voice. She watched as a huge paw came into view from the bushes. Despite the heat from the fire, Alicia suddenly felt chilled, as if she'd been doused in icy water. From the darkness of the forest stepped an enormous cougar, and it looked hungry. And speaking of enormous cougars, we have one right here, Mr. Julby. So we hope you enjoyed these chapters of Finding the Lost in our chat with Michael Foster. And when he was talking about the cougar stone or cougar mountain earlier, that was reference to the character that we just met here. We'll find out a little bit more in the coming chapters, but We hope you enjoyed. We hope you'll join us again next Wednesday at noon Pacific time while we continue reading from Finding the Lost. And also join us Friday at 5 p.m. Pacific, talking to author Sean Minster and reading some stories, or a story, from What Goes Unseen. Yeah, thanks for watching.